In the summer of 1874, a small group of buffalo hunters were attacked by an overwhelming force of Comanches, Kiowas, and Southern Cheyenne. Outnumbered more than 20 to 1 and with no way out, the odds weren't just bad, they were downright hopeless. That's when one of the hunters, Billy Dixon, pulled off the impossible. Raised that old Sharps rifle of his and made what would go down as the shot of the century, dropping a mounted warrior at nearly 1,500 yards. A shot that not only changed the course of the battle, but possibly even the history of the Southern Plains. Less than 3 months later, Dixon would be pinned down yet again, this time in a buffalo waller. And despite being wounded, he still managed to rush through a hell of bullets to save one of his fellow scouts, an action that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. But who was Billy Dixon? Is he really the frontier legend he's made out to be, or just another lucky marksman who happened to be in the right place at the right time? And did he really pick that warrior off at 3/4 of a mile without a scope? Stick around and find out. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
William Billy Dixon was born in Ohio County, West Virginia on September 25th, 1850. There's really not much known about Billy's childhood, but he would be orphaned at a fairly early age. His mother died when he was just 10, and his daddy followed in her wake 2 years later. Luckily, Billy had an uncle over in Missouri willing to take he and his sister in. Unfortunately, said sister would also pass away shortly thereafter from typhoid. According to Dixon, quote, "This left me alone in the world. My uncle was kind and good to me, but I stayed with him only a year. I was a strong, rugged boy, unwilling to be dependent upon even a kinsman for my living, and with much resolution, I decided to seek my fortune. While at my uncle's home, I had often met with men who had been to the far west, and their marvelous tales of adventure fired my imagination and filled me with eagerness to do what they had done. My dreams were filled with beautiful pictures of that dim region that lay towards the Rocky Mountains." End of quote. Now, Billy initially found work cutting wood along the Missouri, before traveling to Leavenworth and falling in with an old bullwhacker named Tom Hare. Apparently, old Tom took a liking to young Dixon and hired him right there on the spot at, quote, $50 a month with everything furnished, including guns and ammunition. Now, from what I could tell just by reading Billy's memoirs, most of his travels as a freighter seem to have taken place between Kansas and what's now Colorado. He got to see buffalo for the first time, he worked closely with the Army, saw a gunfight between a pair of gamblers, and even witnessed the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, and all that before his 18th birthday. Now, if you're not familiar, the Medicine Lodge Treaty was a series of agreements signed in 1867 between the U.S. government and several indigenous nations. The natives agreed to surrender vast tracts of land in exchange for food, housing, and various supplies. And despite the treaty being specifically designed to prevent further conflict, it did prove to be an abject failure, mostly on account of the government not living up to their end of the bargain. Not only did the promised provisions never arrive, but the Army also failed to stop white incursion on native land. A sad series of events that would culminate in a little something known as the Red River War, a conflict in which our very own Billy Dixon would most definitely play a role. In the meantime, however, he was just getting pretty handy with a rifle while working as a freighter. So much so that he was often chosen as the designated hunter. Quote, "There were plenty of quails, rabbits, squirrels, and prairie chickens, and I was in my glory. I ranged the country a youthful Daniel Boone, enjoying every moment of the time. I seemed to have a natural aptitude in the handling of firearms. It was my greatest ambition to become a good shot. In latter years, I was counted an expert marksman in any company, regardless of how proficient my rivals might be. I always attributed my skill with the rifle to my natural love of the sport, to steady nerves, and to constant, unremitting practice. Where other men found pleasure in cards, horse racing, and other similar amusements, I was happiest when ranged in the open country with my gun on my shoulder and a dog at my heels, far out among the wild birds and the wild animals." Now, Billy would continue working with those mule trains until the fall of 1869. That's when he and a few of his buddies went on a trapping and hunting expedition along the Saline River there in Kansas. Of course, that's also when folks started paying good money for buffalo hides. So the following spring is when Billy and his pars went full-time hunting bison. Keep in mind that by this point, 1870, there were still an estimated 5.5 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. Nowhere near as many as decades prior, but there was still enough to support 250,000 Native Americans, all the way from Texas up to Canada. This would change drastically over the next decade, mostly on account of the hide hunters. By 1880, there were less than 400,000, and by the turn of the century, there were only 300 remaining buffalo. Now, like I said, this was mostly due to market hunting, but there were other factors as well. In fact, from 1830 to 1870, the number of bison dropped from an estimated 40 million down to less than 6 million. And this was before guys like Billy Dixon even picked up a rifle. Believe it or not, part of this was due to horses. After all, it was the horse that allowed many of the Great Plains tribes to become extremely efficient hunters. And those same horses were competing with the buffalo for resources. There was also a series of droughts, along with a disruption in movement due to migrant travel and settlements, and even diseases from domestic cattle. So yeah, the buffalo really weren't doing all that well, even prior to the hide hunters. But that said, it was ultimately the hide hunters who were responsible for hammering that final nail into the coffin. I'm just not sure if they were fully aware of what they were doing. Not trying to excuse their actions, I personally find it revolting that they would just take the hides and the tongues and pretty much leave the rest to rot. But I do think there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding the hide hunters. For the most part, they were just in it for the money. Simple as that. Once again, I'm not excusing their actions, but I do think a little bit of nuance is important when discussing these topics. Now, initially, Billy and his partners did all their hunting north of the Arkansas River, mostly because everything to the south was legally off limits. This is the land that was set aside for the natives in the aforementioned Medicine Lodge Treaty. According to Dixon, quote, "The Arkansas was called the deadline, south of which no hunter should go. The river was patrolled at intervals by government troops, as a feeble indication that the Medicine Lodge Treaty had not been forgotten. But their vigilance was so lax that there was no difficulty in crossing back and forth without detection. The danger of attack by Indians was a far more potent obstacle to the buffalo hunter. But as the buffaloes grew fewer in number and the price of hides advanced, even this did not deter hardy hunters from undertaking forays into the forbidden country." So yeah, in other words, the buffalo were getting sparse up in Kansas. Guys like Dixon had to travel further and further just to locate bison. So eventually, in the fall of 1872, he threw caution to the wind and headed south to that quote-unquote forbidden country. And despite almost immediately noticing an abundance of sign indicating the presence of Native Americans, he also found an abundance of buffalo. Or as Dixon put it, buffalo had begun coming in by the thousands, so we agreed to remain 2 or 3 days and make as big a kill as possible. And as luck would have it, they made it out unscathed. Ended up hauling their hides back to Dodge City and selling them for a whopping $2,000, which, adjusted for inflation, is over $50,000 in today's money. That's what I meant earlier when I said that these guys were mostly financially motivated. In a lot of ways, this buffalo hunting was very similar to beaver trapping decades prior, at least in the sense that both occupation caused men to leave the safety of civilization and risk their scalps for a payday. It's my opinion that it was this money, more than a hatred of the indigenous or even government policy, that ultimately led to the demise of the bison. Now, Dixon and his buddies would head south yet again the following spring, traveling as far as Palo Duro Canyon, and once again, they made out like bandits. According to Billy, quote, "It was sometime in February 1874 when we got back to Dodge. We had seen enough to satisfy us that the thing to do would be to go down on the Canadian as soon as the weather settled. While waiting, we went out northwest of Dodge on my old hunting grounds. This is the last hunting I ever did north of the Arkansas. My face was set toward the forbidden country, where the Indians were looking for the scalps of white men." End of quote. Now, be that as it may, it wasn't until later on that march that Billy fell in with a group of like-minded hunters looking to do the same. That said, there were a few logistical issues. First, they needed to figure out how to easily resupply on ammo and various provisions. They'd also need a way to sell their hides without making constant trips back and forth to Kansas. This was solved by merchant A.C. Myers. Basically, he worked out a system where the hunters, like Billy Dixon, would load their wagons with the same sort of supplies they would normally use on the range. Myers would cover the cost, and once they established their camp south of the deadline, he would then sell the provisions to the hunters at a reasonable price. And yeah, so it were in either late March or early May that a caravan of 50 hunters and 30 wagons departed Dodge City, bound for the Texas Panhandle, Billy Dixon among them. Now, while some of these hunters had considerable experience, and others were veterans of the Civil War, there were a few that Billy described as quote-unquote tenderfeet. One in particular, a guy known as Fairchild, was even going around bragging about what a mean little ass kicker he was, and saying that he was going to kill the first Indian that so much as looked at him. As nerve-grating as I'm sure that was, it also put the entire party at risk. You see, the hunters had all agreed that the best course of action was to remain peaceful unless attacked. Or as Billy put it was agreed that if we should encounter Indians and find them manifesting friendship, we would do likewise. This is their country, we argued, and if they would leave us alone, we would do the same. In other words, they didn't need a douchebag like Fairchild kicking the hornet's nest and putting the rest of them in danger. So they decided to teach him a lesson. Long story short, but they had a few guys slip out of camp and fire off their guns to make it seem like they were under attack. And it worked. They frightened Fairchild so badly that he was begging to go back to Dodge City. And when he finally figured out the whole thing was just a joke, he, quote, refused to eat breakfast and sulked for several days. This cured him, however, of wanting to kill an Indian, and ever afterwards he was a good hunter and a good feller, end of quote. So there you have it, a little frontier hazing. Now eventually the hunters arrived at what would become their permanent camp, about 90 or so miles northeast of present-day Amarillo, Texas, a little place known as Adobe Walls. This post first came into being in 1843 to establish trade with the Comanches. The only problem was the Comanche proved unagreeable, so the endeavor was abandoned after just a few years. Charles Bent tried to reopen the walls at least twice before finally giving up and blowing it apart with gunpowder. And that's how it remained until November of 1864. That's when the famous Kit Carson used what was left of the walls to rest his troops after attacking a Kiowa village. What followed was the First Battle of Adobe Walls, as Carson and the soldiers found themselves under attack by an estimated 1,400 warriors. I do have an episode on this battle if you'd like to learn more, a link down below. But simply put, Carson and his men got their asses handed to them. And the walls would remain abandoned for another decade. So yeah, right off the bat, this place doesn't exactly have all that great of a track record, right? But I suppose all that good hide money helped to ease the anxiety. And as you'll soon hear, Dixon and his fellow hunters were basically lulled into complacency. More on that in just a moment, but first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, me, Josh. Look, I'm going to keep this short, but a lot of you have been asking for merchandise, and because I do aim to please, I've gone ahead and relaunched wildwestextramerch.com with brand new designs. We got t-shirts, we got hats, we got stickers, hell, we even have coasters. And for all you longtime listeners, I've also included some vintage Bloody Beaver merch as well. So if you're looking to support the show and get your hands on some high-quality gear, head on over to wildwestextramerch.com. Grab a hat or a t-shirt or whatever else catches your fancy. Once again, that's wildwestextramerch.com. All right, let's get back to the story. Now, just as soon as Billy and the others arrived there at the walls, they went ahead and raised a couple of stores, along with the sod house to serve as a saloon. They also built a corral for the horses, a mess house, and even a blacksmith shop. So all in all, danger notwithstanding, it really wasn't a bad setup. And even more importantly, there was a ton of buffalo. Matter of fact, Dixon managed to kill so many that he had to return to the walls and hire an additional skinner. That said, the good times wouldn't last forever. Wasn't long until 4 of Dixon's fellow hide hunters were found dead and scalped. And as I'm sure you can imagine, this caused a good deal of excitement. But nevertheless, despite this clear warning from the locals, the hunters refused to call it quits. Rather than abandon such a rich hunt, they instead began traveling in larger groups. I guess thinking maybe that there'd be strength in numbers. They also tried to stay north of the walls under the assumption that the Comanches were in their usual summer camps to the south. And yeah, they pretty much fell into a rhythm. The hunters would fan out into the surrounding prairie, set up satellite camps, and take as many hides as they could fit in their wagons. And then, after unloading them at the walls and stocking up on ammo, they'd head out once again. Believe it or not, after a very short amount of time, they had all but forgotten about those 4 scalped hunters that I mentioned a moment ago. Dixon would even admit to it later on, stating that there was not the, quote, slightest feeling of impending danger. And that really blows my mind. I know hindsight's 20/20, but these guys were smack dab in the middle of Comancheria, home to some of the fiercest warriors who had ever strung a bow. And the hunters, despite already losing 4 of their own, were taking very little in the way of precautions. And it was this carelessness that damn near put them under. As fate would have it, Dixon was back there at the walls on June 26, 1874, just preparing for another long hunt. And as far as he and the others were concerned, everything was hunky-dory. Quote, several hunters had come in that day, and we planned to stay up late that night celebrating our return to the range, telling stories of past experiences and joking about how much money we would have when the hunt was over. The night was sultry, and we sat with open doors. In all that vast wilderness, ours were the only lights save for the stars that glittered above us. There was just a handful of us out there on the plains, each bound to the other by the common tie of standing together in the face of any danger that threatened us. It was a simple code, but about the best I know of. Outside could be heard at intervals the muffled sound of the stock moving and stumbling, or a picketed horse shaking himself as he paused in his hunt for grass. In the timber along Adobe Walls Creek to the east, owls were hooting. We paid no attention to these things, however, and in our fancied security against all foes, frolicked and had a general good time. Hannaran did a thriving trade. Hannaran, of course, was the saloon owner. Matter of fact, it was Hannaran's saloon that ended up saving their lives. You see, early the next morning, round about 2 a.m., the hide hunters were jolted awake by what sounded like a rifle. They investigated, and it just turned out to be a cracked ridgepole over at Hannaran's saloon, which they immediately began fixing to stop the roof from collapsing. And by the time they were done, it was too late to go back to sleep, so Billy just started packing up his wagon to get an early start. And that's when all hell broke loose. According to Dixon, quote, "Turning to my bed, I rolled it up and threw it on the front of my wagon. As I turned to pick up my gun, which lay on the ground, I looked in the direction of our horses. They were in sight, but something else caught my eye. Just beyond the horses, at the edge of some timber, was a large body of objects advancing vaguely in the dusky dawn toward our stock, and in the direction of Adobe Walls. Though keen of vision, I could not make out what the objects were, even by straining my eyes. Then I was thunderstruck. The black body of moving objects suddenly spread out like a fan, and from it went up one single solid yell, a war whoop that seemed to shake the very air of the early morning. Then came the thunder and roar of running horses, and the hideous cries of individual warriors, each embarked in the onslaught. I could see that hundreds of Indians were coming. Had it not been for that ridgepole, all of us would have been asleep. By the way, on this day in particular, there were only 28 men and one woman there at the walls. Everyone else was out hunting bison. And here they were being attacked by a combined force of around 700 Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne. As for Dixon, he managed to dive headfirst into Hannaran's saloon just as the bullets were whipping up dust all around him. It was there where he was joined by the proprietor, James Hannaran, along with Bat Masterson and 6 others. The rest of the defenders were spread out between the 2 stores. And yeah, that is the same Bat Masterson who would go on to become friends with Wyatt Earp. Supposedly, at just 20 years of age, Bat was the youngest of the defenders there at the walls. Now, believe it or not, those charging warriors would get so close that they were able to strike the outside of the saloon with the butts of their rifles. Or at least they were before Billy and the others drove them back. To once more quote Dixon, "Time and again, with the fury of a whirlwind, the Indians charged upon the building, only to sustain greater losses than they were able to inflict. This was a losing game, and if the Indians kept it up, we stood a fair chance of killing most of them. I am sure that we surprised the Indians as badly as they surprised us. They expected to find us asleep, unprepared for an attack. Their medicine man had told them that all they would have to do was to come to Adobe Walls and knock us on the head with sticks, and that our bullets would not be strong enough to break an Indian's skin. The old man was a bad prophet." Now that prophet in question was a Comanche holy man named Isate. He had somehow convinced his people that he could both raise the dead and stop bullets. All they had to do was embrace his power, his medicine, and they could finally defeat the white man once and for all. Sounds pretty crazy, but keep in mind that many modern-day Christians have prophets of their own, some of whom recently predicted a rapture that failed to materialize. Again. Look, there's never been a shortage of false prophets looking to take advantage of the desperate, right? I can't help but think of this family I knew growing up. We actually went to the same church, and they had a daughter who was very, very sick. They went to all the specialists, they had her on dialysis, they were doing everything they were supposed to do, but nothing worked. So finally, out of desperation, they took her to a faith healer. I'm not going to say the guy's name, but he's a very famous televangelist worth millions of dollars. These parents were good, salt-of-the-earth people, and they gave their hard-earned money to a professional con artist. Why? Because they were desperate. At that point in time, they were willing to do anything they possibly could to save their little girl, up to and including putting their faith in a charlatan. Point being, desperate people will oftentimes do things that don't necessarily make sense to the rest of us, and the Comanche were certainly no exception. Keep in mind that they had been ravaged by disease. Their territory was growing smaller and smaller, their enemies were closing in on all sides, and the buffalo, the one thing they relied upon to feed their children, was vanishing before their very eyes. So yeah, by 1874, the Comanche were getting desperate. And it was partly this desperation, in my opinion, that led to many of them putting their faith in Aisate. Now, like I said earlier, the hide hunters were successful in fending off that initial charge. The warriors would make a few more half-hearted attempts, but by later on that afternoon, they had pulled back out of range. Fight still wasn't over, though. Dixon and the others may have kept the hostiles at bay with those big guns, but they only had a finite supply of ammunition. And to make matters worse, all of their horses, save for a handful, had either been killed or run off. In other words, they had no other option but to remain where they were and just hope for the best. That said, they would begin venturing out of the buildings later on that evening. Only 3 of the hide hunters had been killed, so they conducted a quick burial and started dragging off some of the dead horses to cut down on the stench. Following day, they and the Comanches briefly exchanged fire from a distance, but that was pretty much it. It wasn't until the 3rd day of the siege, on June 28, 1874, that Billy Dixon pulled off what's now known as the shot of the century. If you don't mind, I'll let Billy explain what happened in his own words. On the 3rd day, a party of about 15 Indians appeared on the side of the bluff east of Adobe Walls Creek, and some of the boys suggested that I try my big 50 on them. The distance was not far from 3/4 of a mile. I took careful aim and pulled the trigger. We saw an Indian fall from his horse. The others dashed out of sight behind a clump of timber. A few moments later, 2 Indians ran quickly on foot to where the dead Indian lay, seized his body, and scurried to cover. They had risked their lives, as we had frequently observed, to rescue a comrade who might not only be wounded, but dead. I was admittedly a good marksman, yet this was what might be called a scratch shot. End of quote. Now, just in case you weren't paying attention, Billy just shot a mounted warrior at a distance of 3/4 of a mile, or a little over 1,300 yards. We'll discuss this more in just a minute, but a shot like that is beyond impressive. It also may have been the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, you gotta think, the Comanches were already demoralized by failing to secure an easy victory. One of their top fighters, Quanah Parker, had been wounded. That medicine man Aisate, he had his horse shot up from underneath him. And then, on top of all that, here was this Billy Dixon guy killing one of them from damn near a mile away. As far as the Comanches were concerned, this was bad medicine all around. And from that point on, the fight was basically over. Hunters soon began straggling in from the outlying camps, and by day 6, they had about 100 men to help hold off any remaining hostiles. Sadly, however, there was an additional fatality. One of the defenders, William Olds, accidentally blew his head off while climbing down a ladder. If you recall, it was Olds who was the husband of the lone woman there at the walls. According to Dixon, quote, "Just as I entered Rath's store, I saw Olds coming down the ladder with his gun in his hand. A moment later, his gun went off accidentally, tearing off the top of Olds' head. At the same instant, Mrs. Olds rushed in from an adjoining room, in time to see the body of her husband roll from the ladder and crumple at her feet, a torrent of blood gushing from the terrible wound. Olds died instantly. Gladly would I have faced all the Indians from the Cimarron to the Red River, rather than to have witnessed this terrible scene. It seemed to me that it would have been better for any other man there to have been taken than the husband of the only woman among us. Her grief was intense and pitiable. A rough lot of men, such as we were, did not know how to comfort a woman in such distress. We did the best we could, and if we did it awkwardly, it should not be set down against us. Had we been called upon to fight for her, we would not have asked about the odds, but would have sailed in tooth and toenail. But when we tried to speak to her, we just choked up and stood still. We buried Olds that same evening, about 60 feet from the spot where he was killed, just southeast of Rath's store." End of quote. Now, before we go any further, I do want to circle back real quick and address Billy's famous shot. Even though he said it was 3/4 of a mile, the distance was actually measured later on, and it turned out to be around 1,500 yards. Just in case there's anyone listening who may not be all that familiar with firearms, hitting a target at 1,500 yards is extremely difficult, especially if you're not using a scope. I'll put it to you like this. You can give the average person a modern-day, high-powered rifle with the most expensive scope that money can buy, and chances are they still wouldn't be able to hit the broadside of a barn at 1,500 yards. Myself included. Hell, even a trained marksman would struggle to hit a target at 1,500 yards. I remember watching this TV show years ago, and there was a couple of ex-military guys. I want to say one of them was a Navy SEAL, but I could be misremembering. And they were out in the middle of the desert trying to recreate a shot made by a Canadian sniper in Afghanistan. And despite the shooters being highly trained and using top-of-the-line equipment, they still weren't able to pull it off. Now, granted, they were aiming it over 2 miles away, but their conclusion was that while the Canadian sniper was most definitely highly skilled, I mean, you gotta be highly skilled to even get close to a target at that distance, but it was their opinion that luck played a role. And I do think the same thing can be said for Billy Dixon. Just to further illustrate how difficult this is, there was an editor for Guns Magazine, Mike Venturino, who attempted to recreate Dixon's shot about a decade ago. They had this 4x8 sheet of plywood that they painted white and then set up at 1,500 yards. And according to Mr. Venturino, quote, "Altogether we, 13 shooters, fired a total of 151 rounds. Periodically, we ceased fire and had our spotter inspect the target area. There were grooves in the soft ground on the other side of the plywood and in front and behind it. Finally, in the afternoon, a local 13-year-old named Connor lofted a bullet that landed just in front of the target and penetrated on its bounce. Later, Bozeman resident Rich Morris, firing his own Shiloh 4570, got a solid hit that, surprisingly, bounced off the plywood. So did Billy Dixon actually hit that Indian at 1,500 yards? Maybe, but I couldn't." End of quote. Now, full disclosure, Billy Dixon was shooting a rifle chambered in 50-90 as opposed to 45-70, so he would have definitely had a bit more stopping power, but I think you get the picture, right? No matter what kind of a gun you're using, it is not easy hitting a target, even a big target, at 1,500 yards, especially with open sights. Not only does it take a whole hell of a lot of skill, but it also takes some good old-fashioned luck. And he did it on the first try. Now, like I said earlier, the battle was pretty much over by that third day. And unfortunately for the Comanche, their time as the lords of the southern plains was also quickly drawing to an end. It was just 3 months later when the army caught them with their pants down over at Palo Duro Canyon. Casualties were light, but the soldiers were able to destroy not only their winter village, but also around 1,000 Comanche ponies. And without food or sufficient mounts, they really had no other choice but to report to the reservation. That wasn't until late September, though. In the meantime, Billy Dixon would find himself in yet another fight for his life, one that would end up earning him the prestigious Medal of Honor. You see, after that battle there at Adobe Walls, Billy took a job as a civilian scout under General Nelson Miles. He and 4 soldiers, along with another scout named Amos Chapman, were delivering dispatches when they ran smack dab into a force of around 100 Comanches and Kiowas. And since they were completely surrounded with nowhere to hide, they simply dismounted right there on the prairie and tried to make a stand of it. By the way, in case you're curious, this was about 20 or so miles from present-day Canadian Texas. Now, although Dixon and his compadres were initially able to keep their opponents at bay, they paid a very heavy price. Private George W. Smith took a bullet through his lung and was presumed dead. Their horses were stampeded, and everyone else, including Dixon, sustained wounds. That's when Billy noticed a nearby waller. Quote, "Our situation was growing more desperate every minute. I knew something had to be done and quickly, or else all of us in a short while would be dead or in the hands of the Indians, who would torture us in the most inhumane manner before taking our lives. I could see where the buffaloes had pawed and wallowed a depression, commonly called a buffalo waller, and I ran for it at top speed. It seemed as if a bullet whizzed past me at every jump, but I got through unharmed. The waller was about 10 feet in diameter. I found its depth, though slight, afforded some protection. I shouted to my comrades to try to come to me, which all of them, save for Smith and Chapman, commenced trying to do. As each man reached the waller, he drew his butcher knife and began digging desperately with knife in hands to throw up dirt around the sides. The land happened to be sandy, and we made good headway, though constantly interrupted by the necessity of firing at the Indians as they dashed within range. Now, shortly thereafter is when Dixon rushed out to save his fellow scout, Amos Chapman. He ended up tossing the wounded man across his back and carrying him to the waller under a hail of bullets. He also tried retrieving Smith, but it was just too damn hot. I guess Billy didn't want to risk his life for what he and the others assumed was a dead man. And yeah, for the next few hours, they just laid there baking under the hot Texas sun and doing their level best to hold off the hostiles. Thankfully, they had a rainstorm to quench their thirst later on that evening, but said storm also ushered in a blue norther. So they basically went from sweltering to freezing their asses off in the matter of just a few minutes. They were also running low on bullets. So that being the case, one of the soldiers, Private Peter Roth, ran out to grab Smith's rifle and ammunition. And in doing so, he was shocked to discover that Smith was still alive. That's when Dixon ran out to help, and they were able to carry him back to the waller, but sadly, Private Smith would succumb to his wounds later on that night. Of course, by morning time, the Comanches had already broken off their attack, so Billy set out on foot looking for help. As luck would have it, he was able to locate several companies of the 8th Cav under a Major William Price. And believe it or not, Price just left them there. I'm not making this up. The Major had a surgeon check out their wounds, and some of the soldiers handed out hardtack, but that's it. They weren't given any bullets, no spare horses, nothing. Price just simply left them there with the promise that he would inform General Miles of their whereabouts. So Billy and his compadres were forced to spend another day right there in the waller before finally being rescued. Now, like I said, Dixon would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions, but it was later rescinded by Congress on account of him being a civilian. That said, the Army would reinstate the award well over a century later, in 1989. As for Dixon, he'd continue scouting until 1883. That's when he returned to the Panhandle and established a little homestead within spitting distance of Adobe Walls. He got married about a decade later to a Miss Olive King, and they would have a total of 7 children, the last of whom passed away as recently as 1995. In fact, 2 of his sons, Hugh and Archie, would even serve during the Second World War. And yeah, for the next few decades, Dixon worked as a sheriff, a rancher, justice of the peace, land commissioner, and even a postmaster. The family would move to Cimarron, Oklahoma in 1906, and it's there on March 9th, 1913, at the age of 62, that the great Billy Dixon finally passed away from pneumonia. But not before dictating his memoirs to his wife Olive. In fact, Olive would spend pretty much the rest of her life dedicated to preserving and promoting Billy's legacy. She actually went into debt publishing his memoirs. She also got a small monument placed there at the site of the Buffalo Waller fight, as well as a grave marker for Private Smith. And then finally, on June 27, 1929, exactly 55 years to the day of the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, Olive had her late husband's body reinterred right there on the battleground. And it's there where Billy Dixon rests to this day, not far from the men he had helped bury. Mrs. Dixon would pass away herself just a year later. She had gone out to eat barbecue with her daughter Edna and her son-in-law, and on the drive home, she just quietly slumped over on her daughter's shoulder, and that was that. And look, I don't want to make light of Mrs. Dixon's death, but hey, we all gotta die at some point, right? And I don't know about you, but me personally, I don't think I'd mind going out in the exact same fashion. Just quietly passing to the other side with a belly full of Texas barbecue. Now, before we wrap things up, I would like to mention one last thing regarding the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. I mentioned earlier how the hunters were all woken up at around 2 a.m. by what sounded like the crack of a rifle, only to then discover it was that broken lodgepole over at Hannaran's saloon. Well, per legend, Mr. Hannaran was tipped off to the impending attack days prior, and he didn't tell anyone because he thought it would hurt his business. Apparently, he got nervous the morning of and fired off his rifle to wake everyone up. And then when they came to investigate, he just made up the story about the cracked lodgepole. For what it's worth, I don't think this has ever been proven, and I personally would love to see a primary source on Hannaran having prior knowledge of the attack, but this theory was somewhat corroborated by Billy Dixon. He would claim in his memoirs that he and several other hunters examined the ridgepole, and they never located a crack or a split. So make of that what you will. Also, another theory that, so far as I'm aware, has not been proven. But if you remember the scene from Young Guns 2, where Deputy Carlisle got killed over at White Oaks, well, there was a Carlisle right there at Adobe Walls, who Billy Dixon referred to as Bermuda Carlisle. And there are some who think that the Adobe Walls Carlisle and the White Oaks Carlisle were one and the same. Like I said, I don't know how true this is, but it's fun to think about. I mean, can you imagine surviving a fight like Adobe Walls and having a badass nickname like Bermuda, only to then be gunned down by your own posse just a few years later without barbecue? But yeah, on that note, I guess that's about all I've got on Billy Dixon. Thank you so much for joining me. Please head on over to wildwestextramerch.com and pick up some swag. And if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and close things out with the final passage from Billy's memoirs, The Life and Adventures of Billy Dixon, which, if you haven't already read, you are definitely missing out. It really is one of the better biographies as far as the Old West is concerned. But anyway, here we go. Quote, I fear that the conquest of savagery in the Southwest was due more often to the love of adventure than to any wishes that cities should arise in the desert, or that the highways of civilization should take the place of the trails of the Indian and the buffalo. In fact, many of us believed and hoped that the wilderness would remain forever. Life there was to our liking. Its freedom, its dangers, its tax upon the strength and courage all gave zest to the living, especially to young men, unapproached by anything to be found in civilized communities. Therefore, let it be said that if there was bravery and heroism, it came less by design than it did from the emergencies of accident and surroundings. That the Indian should have resisted, with relentless and increasing ferocity, every effort to drive him from his paradise was natural and justifiable from his point of view. In those days, he felt that to go somewhere else meant starvation and death for his family and tribe. Above all, he firmly believed that the country was his, as it had been from the beginning, and that the white man was cruel, merciless, and wrong in depriving him of his old home, a home that the white man did not need and would not use. I am often questioned about my experiences on the frontier, as if the life had been filled with unbearable hardships, to be shunned and forgotten. Gladly would I live it all over again. Such is my cast of mind and my hunger for the freedom of the big wide places. I would run the risk and endure all the hardships that were naturally ours, just for the contentment and freedom to be found in such an outdoor life. I should be unspeakably happy once more to feast on buffalo meat and other wild game cooked on a campfire, sourdough biscuit and black coffee, the latter drank from a quart cup. But those days are gone forever, and we must content ourselves with the present and make the best of our opportunities. Coming generations will never know the trials and hardships we endured. We helped build a great empire in the West. Let it be governed justly and made to serve the needs of humanity. End of quote, and adios.